Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our best and last session of the day. John, thank you so much for coming down from New York. Today we're going to talk about the technical ambitions of Filecoin. Filecoin is, I think, the most technically ambitious thing in crypto. It's pretty hard to understand all of it. I don't think we're going to cover all of it today, but we're going to try to. It's a super cool thing. I used to hate Filecoin for a very long time and did a 180. And I've been getting to learn more, and I'm pretty excited about the vision. So let's kick things off, John, and start with your background. Who is John? How did you end up at PL?
Yeah, great to meet everyone. Yeah, my name is Jonathan Victor. I also go by John or JV. I've been at Protocol Labs for about 4.5 years now. I guess working backwards, undergrad, I ended up going to BlackRock for a hot summer. Didn't love TradFi. Post-college, went to Palantir, was there for a couple years. About middle of 2019, it was like the bear market. I'd been following IPFS since 2016 or so, not because, well, in 2016, ETH was going off. Everything was super exciting in crypto. I didn't really understand much of it at the time. I could tell there was something interesting. I couldn't tell how it was going to be useful. I was listening to a bunch of talks, and a talk that Juan gave about IPFS was the one thing that really resonated with me, purely because it's like interesting from a distributed systems point of view. Middle of 2019, I'd been at Palantir for about 4 years, and so at that point, it was more about what are the interesting things I could work on. IPFS, future of the internet, it made a lot of sense to me. There was still many open questions, but that's what sort of pushed me to take the leap. Over the last 4.5 years, I've gotten to work on Filecoin's proofs. I led that for a bit. I led product work, so I led the building of a number of storage on-ramps. I've done a lot of our collabs work for folks in the Solana ecosystem, so like Magic Eden, folks like Rarible, just different teams that are building. And now I spend a lot of time just talking about Filecoin and helping people understand what's going on in the ecosystem.
You use the word IPFS a lot. What does that acronym mean?
Oh, yeah. It stands for the Interplanetary File System, which is basically a running joke about how the internet today wouldn't work if we were trying to be an interplanetary species. And so IPFS is a reimagining of how could we build the internet in a way that's more peer-to-peer and inherently more resilient, and also could operate in a world where maybe we are an interplanetary species with people both on Mars and on Earth.
So you're saying Juan and Elon have some sort of secret chat thing?
Together,
they're planning the future of the internet together. Okay, thank you for that context on IPFS. And sorry, like what's like the key like defining feature, content addressing, and such for IPFS? Like why does it matter?
Yeah, so maybe to give a short example, let's say I was talking about a book like To Kill a Mockingbird. The way that the internet works today, I would be telling you to go fly to New York. In the middle of town, there's a library. Go into the library, 3 bookshelves in, 1 book on the right. That's the book that you want. Now, that's like kind of an insane way of talking about books because, of course, many things could go wrong. Your flight could get canceled. The library could burn down. A different book could be there. But you would have no idea because I didn't tell you what you were looking for. I told you where to go. The main idea with IPFS is rather than describing things based on where it is, we should instead describe it by what it is. So a different version of me describing To Kill a Mockingbird is if I gave you the name of the book, like the ISBN number, the weight, the cover art, then you could ask me, you could ask Kyle, you could ask Shayon. And even if they don't know, they could ask their friends, and if they get a copy of a book back, they could check to see that it matches the description, and then they could also hit it to you, and you could check that it matches the description. So in that way, we're no longer reliant on going to that one library and that one location to find the book. Instead, you could just ask someone for a copy, and the closest copy could be the thing that's served back to you.
I haven't heard the library analogy. That one's very good. I like it.
Okay.
Cool. All right, so IPFS is a way to find books or other content on the internet. What does IPFS have to do with Filecoin? What is Filecoin?
Yeah, so IPFS as a macro bet is really thinking about a number of trends that are like secular to crypto, but I think this is just like where computing is going. There's an increase in the amount of data that's being generated. There's like tons of charts on this, but you could also just intuitively think about, look at the like amount of data that AR and VR is generating, or AI when we think about the models that we might want to ship to the edge. It's also increasing in terms of the amount of hardware and like the power that you have in your pockets or in your laptops. The compute chips that your computers have at at the edge, like your device, is more powerful now than it was a decade ago. Equally, the amount of storage that you have is going up. And so like these are trends that are separate from like everything else that we talk about in crypto. And the big idea with IPFS is when you can start using data and building applications that aren't talking about a specific server, you can start making use of all of that hardware. So if I'm building an application, I don't have to say, like, OK, everyone's going to go to this one AWS server in order to go grab the data. If it happens to be on my device already, I can build an application that just references that. So a good example of why this might practically be useful is, like, if you are in an airplane and trying to use Google Docs, it is a terrible experience.
Yes.
But if you have content addressing, you could actually work locally, and then just when you land, your local copy will sync with the rest of the internet. So the reason I went off on that little tangent, how does Filecoin fit in, is like IPFS is good from a distributed systems perspective, and this is why companies like Cloudflare have been like building in the ecosystem for like years now. It's just good from distributed systems. The question, though, is like, if content addressing is right, one version of how the internet evolves is that we use content addressing everywhere, but in all the things that are not on local devices, we still use a hyperscaler, like Amazon, Google, Microsoft. The big idea that Filecoin tries to address is it says, look, we believe the content addressing story is right and is like looking at the trends correctly. But like, what if there's a more efficient way of delivering the services of those hyperscalers rather than having a single integrated entity? And so this is where Filecoin tries to say, can we build a market to provide these services? And so the broad buckets I use is storage, retrieval, and compute. On the storage side, you could think of it like S3. On the retrieval side, you could think of like CDNs. On the compute side, you could think of EC2, but obviously there's like many other things that fall in there. But really, it's like, how do we store the data? How do we move the data around? How do we do stuff to the data? And the big idea with Filecoin as an ecosystem is not like a single protocol, but a stack of protocols that allow you to build out the markets to actually have these services that the cloud actually like serves today.
Yeah, one thing I find super exciting about Filecoin is that a computer physically does three things, right? It stores data, processes data, and sends data to other computers, which can in turn store data, process data, et cetera. And like y'all are building markets basically to open up all three of those primitives, and love that. So I've heard there's a thing called the Filecoin master plan. What's the master plan?
Yeah. So I think the way that Juan will tell this story, so Juan is like the founder of Protocol Labs. He like wrote the first IPFS white paper, the Filecoin white paper. So first is build out the largest storage network. You could think of this as like building out your supply side, step number one. Step number two is add data to that network. So bring in demand. Step number three is build out all of these other services. So compute, retrieval, all of the other things that you want to do. And you could think of that as like, there's a number of reasons why, and I'm sure we'll get into like why go in this order. But like the first order bit is like, you want to be able to have as much hardware as possible to build the largest market possible. Market, of course, is like you want to both get physical distribution, so be in as many places as possible, but you also want market competition to keep prices low for users. Adding in the data, you want to bring more utility to that hardware. Having more data in more places is going to be necessary for other pieces of the master plan. But importantly, it means that you have more and more people who are coming to the network to make use of the services on the network. The third piece, building out these services, so like compute for transformation, retrieval networks, folks who are building databases, all of these build compounding. So it takes the data that's already on the network, it can generate more data, which can make more use of the storage, and so on.
And then let's talk about hardware here. What is a Filecoin storage provider or a miner today? Like, what are the major hardware components they have?
Yeah, so Filecoin as a network is effectively building a network of data centers. So it's a little bit of a misnomer because the first thing that Filecoin built as a service was storage, but storage is just one of those verticals. So storage, retrieval, compute. The actual physical infrastructure that each of these data centers are bringing is not just a hard drive, it's also bringing GPUs and CPUs. It's building, like, some of them have like very like high-end bandwidth as well, but it's literally just like data centers that are providing services into this network. And so what makes it really interesting is it gives you now the substrate to be able to upgrade to start adding more and more services. So folks like the I/O network are looking at harnessing the GPUs that are on Filecoin to enable sort of like the AI companies that they want to sell their services to. Of course, if those GPUs are sitting next to hard drives, it means that you have a place to stick the output data sets directly after. And you can do it at a cheap cost because you're not shipping the data around to like a different hard drive that might be in a different country or something like that.
Yeah, it's going to be cool to see different DPIN networks or virtual networks like work together or collaborate. I don't know exactly how it's going to work mechanically, but there's a really cool opportunity there. All right, so we've talked about bandwidth compute storage marketplaces. Y'all, about 4 or 5 months ago, launched a thing called the Filecoin Virtual Machine, or the FVM. What is the FVM?
Yeah. So one way of thinking of these services, so like storage, retrieval, compute, is that these are like real-world services that are anchoring into a shared block space. And so what makes the FVM really interesting is it gives us the ability to program two types of things. The first is programmability between these services. So as an example, in the Filecoin network, if I want to store a piece of data, I can set up a contract with a data center or a number of data centers to say, like, please store 5 copies for some period of time, which is cool. So like, it will then, every 24 hours, these providers have to prove that this data is on the network. But maybe I want to do something more sophisticated to say, OK, I want to store 5 copies on the network, but if one of them falls off, I want to set an incentive that a new one is stored. Well, that's something that you can do with a smart contract. And this is what the FVM sort of enables as like a data service. So you can write a program to say, always make sure that there's 5 copies of data on the network. If I ever drop beneath that copy count in some period of time, set an incentive for someone to store a new copy, and they can only claim this bounty once that new copy has been stored. So you can program data services as like one important feature. And that extends to the compute stuff, so being able to trigger new compute jobs to store the output data sets, et cetera. But importantly, it also allows you to program the flow of funds. So as an example, there's a team in our ecosystem called Glyph who is building effectively wrappers around storage providers. So as I mentioned, every storage provider is a data center. This is a normal business, but it exists as an on-chain entity. And so if you think about what would it mean to build lending markets for these different storage providers, when you have this entity that exists as an on-chain entity and you can build a smart contract around them, this smart contract can now start building out all the financial tools that we might see in like Web 2, but as Web 3 primitives. So if a storage provider has a recurring cash flow and wants to borrow against that, well, you have now a smart contract as an agent that can do the processing to make sure that that capital flow is being resold and actually delivered to whoever is the buyer of whatever asset.
Yeah, one of the things I love about Glyph is like, if you think about in Ethereum and Solana and those kinds of networks, the like atomic kind of thing on those networks is a token. And the kind of like foundational finance primitive on those networks is the ability to trade. So you kind of Uniswap in the case of Ethereum or Phoenix or whatever in the case of Solana. What I love about Glyph is like, well, what's the atomic unit of work in Filecoin? It's like storing stuff. And Glyph is like providing that foundational financial primitive. And it's very cool to see that getting unlocked by the FVM. All right, so we can get some capital efficiency gains by doing something like that. Can you do something like permanent storage? You know, like Arweave's the other kind of file storage thing people talk a lot about. Can you use the FVM to build something of that nature?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, you can do like these data service things, you can do the capital services, and of course you can combine them together. So when I think of what would an Arweave competitor look like on Filecoin, well, it would look like a mixture of both. You would need an endowment, something that's generating yield both in dollars and in Filecoin, which are the two currencies that miners have to spend in order to actually run their operations. And so you want to just make sure that you're generating enough yield in your endowment to fund your ongoing liabilities. So like that is a DeFi problem, which is like capital services. On the storage side, all you're doing is saying, how many copies do you want to store and for how long? You don't have to specify an end date. You could just say, I would like to always spend down from my endowment to make sure that there's a minimum of 5 copies of this data on the network. And so together, you could actually build protocols, and there's teams that are working on this, to do things like build perpetual storage, but you can even do more. So if you wanted, instead of having a perpetual storage protocol, you could just say, I need a retention period of 5 years, and pick whatever duration makes sense for you. Or if you want to increase the resilience and say, I don't want to accept like a 0.001% tail risk, I want to move that all the way out to like 9 digits or whatever, you can choose to just store more copies so that you can get more security as well. So a lot of what Filecoin has done is just made it possible to build the composability that you need. So the network provides you these very basic primitives, but then you can stitch them together to do more sophisticated things.
You just talked about tail risk, you know, like whatever servers blow up. Does the Filecoin protocol understand the notion of geography, and is there any way to program, you know, I want data in China, I don't want data in China, kind of a thing?
Not natively, though there are people who are working on different solutions that would give you some heuristics on this by like pinging other nodes on the network. What's interesting is we're seeing people basically operate kind of like a hybrid model. So a good example is Ernst & Young is working with some folks on the storage provider side to basically take the Web 2 certifications that they might normally do, but then issue them as verifiable credentials. So it gets interesting is if you're someone like the IO network who wants to work with like AI companies who don't want to just send their data to random locations or to random data centers, you could basically filter and say, I only want to work with the storage provider set that is holding this verifiable credential from like these 10 providers, Ernst & Young, KPMG, yada, yada, yada. And so I think what we'll see is probably this hybrid on-chain, off-chain, where like people are basically working with like entities that they trust, but they're designating who they want in that trust set to bring off-chain primitives on-chain, whether that's certifications or attestations about location or anything of the sort.
All right, so we've talked a lot about the FVM and storage. You mentioned earlier retrieval and compute. So what are the file storage? Well, how big is the file storage network today?
Yeah, so Filecoin is, I don't have off the top of my head the latest. I think it's somewhere around like 13 exabytes of storage capacity, which to give context is like, I think about 13,000 Library of Congresses, I think is the number.
Yeah. It's like single-digit % of AWS, right?
Yeah, it's large, and it grows quite aggressively. I guess like another way of giving people a heuristic here, so like your phone is probably storing on the order of gigabytes. The thing after that is terabytes. The thing after that is petabytes. And the thing after that is exabytes. So we're talking about like bananas amounts of storage. CERN, the particle physics lab, has about 100 petabytes of storage. And so this is like 13,000 CERNs is like another way of framing that.
Yeah, it's a lot. And then, so let's talk about kind of the cool stuff that's got, FVM just launched a few months ago. What's some of the cool stuff coming up? I know you've got some retrieval stuff, you've got some compute stuff. What's there?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different, in those verticals, and I'm going to keep air-handing this, but like in storage, retrieval, and compute, I would say like each of these are their own separate swim lanes with different progress bars. So I think on the storage side, one of the most interesting features is people taking the cutting edge of what's been happening in the IPFS ecosystem, putting it together with Filecoin and trying to take that to enterprise. So there's teams like Seal, teams like Banyan, who are really just focused on like how do we make onboarding as easy as possible and make it basically like a productized solution which storage providers can just turn on a switch to be able to take paid deals from enterprises. I think that's important both because it is like one part of like the Filecoin story which is pretty differentiated, which is like how do you bring net new cash flows into this economy purely by offering a service to the world. That's what's going on, and I think the most interesting stuff probably in the next quarter or two coming out of the storage side. I think on the retrieval side, there's a number of teams working on retrieval markets. So there's teams like Titan who are building a retrieval network. There's one being incubated by Protocol Labs called Saturn. Saturn is currently in alpha. Today it has about 5,000 nodes that are in operation. It handles about 50% of the IPFS gateway traffic that Protocol Labs runs. If you go to explorer.saturn.tech, you can actually see like a live map of where all these nodes are, how much traffic they're doing. The CDN work is actually really important because there's a physical component to it. Where like if you want, for folks who don't know what a CDN is, by the way, if you go on YouTube and you try to like download a video, you'll notice that the ad loads very, very quickly. That's because it's cached with the CDN to be very local to you, so it can load fast. Versus if you're watching a video and you're trying to download it from like Asia or something, it'll be super slow. The reason for this is like physical distance is a really important property, especially when we're talking about really big assets. So with Saturn, the exciting piece is that by building a permissionless network where anyone can join, you basically can build out a CDN without having to put out the capital outlay of a Cloudflare or like an Akamai, who are like the market leaders. You can say like anyone can sign up to join into this network. And to date, even while it's still in alpha, there's been 5,000 plus nodes that have joined.
Yeah, one thing I want to highlight about just like the CDN vision is it's been one of the dreams of crypto for like 8-10 years of like all these computers, they all have a down and an up connection. Can we repurpose that in an intelligent way? And it's very exciting to see the Filecoin team pioneering a lot of that stuff. All right, cool. When are we going to see some traditional Web 2 companies using Filecoin directly?
Yeah. So hopefully as these storage teams come off, we'll see more. Though I will point out, we are still seeing like enterprise adoption in like smaller like one-offs. So there's a team out in Australia called Holland who actually got the Victor Chang Institution, which is like a cancer research organization, to start using Filecoin as their backend. The SEAL team has done a great job actually like pushing, especially in the sciences. And like what we've seen as sort of a pattern is areas where verifiability is a really important property is actually a place where, not even based on cost, but based on like the primitives, there's a lot more like interest in Filecoin. But equally, we're seeing it also in places where there's just like a large amount of data and like the capital needs are like, this is a huge cost savings opportunity. And I think especially given like interest rates, that's like actually quite attractive depending on which institution you're talking to. So today, I think on the archival side of the house, there is actually traction and it continues to grow. I think the thing that's exciting for use cases like Saturn and especially some of the scalability work, which is happening with IPC, is it's opening the door for much more consumer-facing use cases. And so when we talk about like building games as an example, like today when people talk about games, like they may have some portions that are on-chain and then some portions that are just like hosted in AWS. This actually gives you an opportunity to run those portions in something that could run at Web 2 scale. And I think that's going to be the attractive piece for folks who are trying to build out. And again, a lot of this is leaning into the content addressing pieces more. But like if you're trying to save on cost or improve distribution, that's where like there will be opportunities.
Any specific order of operations we need to do to get to that future?
Yeah, I do think like the master plan is like a good cheat sheet, though also Shayan laid it out in his presentation. So I think great minds think alike. Where I do think it's important first to get your supply side because it gives you a thing that can offer like a service to the world. I think the important piece after is like, how do you build the demand side in as a fast follow? I think what's been interesting about the Filecoin network is both the acquisition of hardware, but building out these base primitives that allow for a lot of these interesting use cases to be built on top. And I think like that's probably what we're going to see more of in the next quarter or two as people continue to ship and like continue to push on the BD side and win more of these use cases. I think, yeah, like in totality, my expectation is like for the Filecoin economy to like continue to grow, we basically want to see the use cases that require the least incremental extra work. Like you want one new thing that you have to add in order to unlock the next vertical. So on the enterprise side, I think really being able to add in like WinFS and being able to add in encryption so you can do permissioning and ACLs and all the normal enterprise-y things is actually a really big unlock for being able to go to more and more use cases inside of the enterprise realm and sell effectively. Yeah.
On the flip side, what are the major headwinds and challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially inside of crypto, obviously like there's a lot of work going on to try to build better bridges and better UX. Like crypto itself, although we've come very far, there's still a lot to do in figuring out what are the right ways that you can build things that make it compatible with how organizations work. Maybe to give a little bit more clarity here, like if you're an enterprise who has large-scale data, you need things like integrations with data movers. Like what are the tools that you already use? So that's like a whole set of work to make that work. But then you need to also build out the tooling for like transfer and making sure that you can actually move all of this data properly. That's a lot of the work that I think continues to happen, but like has, I think, probably like the most work to still do in terms of like making this a really seamless process. I think as an ecosystem, we've seen a lot of investment in basically building out individual verticalized slices that can make each of these things its own little product. So people who are working on like data set auctions, such that if you come in with a data set, you don't have to like manually go look through or like build your own negotiating software. Like you can just go into an auction to like deploy and hit like a wide array of like storage providers. We're seeing folks who are working on data preparation in a way that makes it portable between different providers. So if you work with a front end like a Banyan or a Seal, it still follows into the same canonical standard, which you can then port between them if you want to like move between providers in the future. So a lot of it, I mean, it's really just like under the hood stuff that has to happen. But I think like those are the things that have been getting like the most love and attention, and I think that's what we're going to see more of. In terms of like the headwinds, I think it's really just like in a bear market for teams that are building, just making sure that they're able to get supported, they can easily like invest in the things that need to be invested in, especially at times when capitals are tight.
Yeah, one thing that I kind of think about is like, you know, when AWS launched S3 back in 06 or whatever it was, 05, like there was no infrastructure around kind of cloud data storage. And it took a while for all that stuff to get built out. And I kind of look at IPFS and Filecoin in kind of a similar way. It's like a new storage paradigm, and we just got to get all that plumbing plumbing around it. Cool, we're coming in towards the end, but a few more questions for you. How is just like the ecosystem around Filecoin structured? There's Protocol Labs, there's a Filecoin Foundation. How many employees are there in different groups? How is roles and responsibilities split?
Yeah, so Protocol Labs itself is like a network of many individual companies, and over time, actually, more and more of these teams will spin out. So you can think of Protocol Labs as like a research and development lab where it has like literally from like the deep theoretical to like full implementation, like teams working on different slices. So there's teams that have already spun out. For the VCs in the room, you may have met some of XPL teams like Lurk or Expanso, teams that are working more on the compute side. There's folks like Saturn who eventually will spin out, folks like the IPC team who will spin out. But those are more on like the later stage side of things, which are more like what are products or protocols or services that can be their own entity. We also have folks who are working more on like the research side. So people who do, I don't know if people know this, Filecoin is like the largest in deployment or production use of snarks. Like we have folks, even before, if you go look at the 2017 white paper, we were talking about like how we would need proofs in order to build out the network. So we have like deep theoretical researchers who think about like how can we optimize the protocol, how can we get the cost of running our snarks lower and lower, what protocol improvements can we use to like massively increase the capital efficiency of the network. And we've seen things like sealing as a service is a thing that came out that dropped the cost of adding hardware to the network by like 90%. It's like we see these protocol improvements, and those are like things that happen in our deep research side. Separate from those, which are like the research and engineering teams, you have folks like myself who sit more on the ecosystem side of the house. That includes building out like proof of concept services, so things like NFT storage was like a thing that was incubated in PL, but it also includes things like collabs, so like the work that we've been doing with the Solana Foundation to archive like Solana's history onto Filecoin. There's also folks who work on things like community support for the storage providers, basically helping them get set up as operational businesses. So we run accelerators, basically how do you train people to be data center operators in Web3. We literally have folks who are running the Gambit. But yeah, and so like that's all on like the PL side of the house. On the foundation side, it's much more governance related. It's much more like protocol wide. They manage things like the events that are being run in the ecosystem. So they think more about like community oriented things versus PL, which focuses much more on like core development of like whether it's protocol research to like implementation of, it's one of the 4 implementations of Filecoin, but like Lotus is the one that PL manages, and then things all the way down to like community support, things like that.
It's fair to say PL is a research-driven org, lots of different kind of independent teams, and then Filecoin Foundation is more kind of community-led stuff.
Yeah, maybe in like one word, PL is like builders, Foundation is more stewards.
Got it. All right, well, we have gone through all of our questions, and I think we're coming in on 5 o'clock. I know it's end of the day, so thank you all for being here. John, thanks so much for coming by. We really appreciate it.